So right now, the Europeans have been talking a lot about pan-Europeanism. They've been talking a lot about establishing a pan-European defense force, talking about not just establishing a defense force, but also establishing more independence from American power. So this is a story. This came out recently, published on March 8th, which was recent. Goodness gracious! Right when I want to give my talk, this mouse starts acting up. I mean, really. All right. So it's talking about European. So it says here the European charts its own path. The European Union charts its own path for European rearmament. Now, this reminds me of something that happened in history. It reminds me very much so of what was going on in the years prior to World War I. What was going on before World War I was that you had a giant arms race. And England and Russia and Germany, they were all working, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire to be more specific, they were all working to build up their militaries. And why were they working to build up their militaries? It's very obvious. Because they were preparing for a war. They were all preparing for a war. And they all knew this. But they were acting in the face of the public as if nothing was going on. Everything was just as usual. Everything was just business as usual, right? Nothing special was taking place. But behind the curtains, people were preparing for war. And that's what you see going on right now. And that's why the European Union has been seriously discussing more and more every year about not only forming a robust military force, which would be led by Germany, of course, to lead foreign policy, not just defense, but also foreign policy, but also a lot of discussion on getting the European Union to be more and more independent of American power. So the United States is the empire of the world. The United States is it's the Roman Empire of our time, and English is the lingua franca of our time. So you have this empire called America, and the world is, for the most part, with the exception of a few countries, Russia, China, etc., are dependent on the United States. The Germans want to change this, and that's why you see, for example, a number of years ago, Angela Merkel saying that the days of us really trusting the Anglo-Americans, really trusting, not the Anglo-Americans, but the Americans and the British, are pretty much over. Europe needs to grab a hold of its own destiny and direct its own destiny. And you see people like Ursula von der Leyen saying similar rhetoric. I would say the most extreme rhetoric that I've ever seen came from Jean-Claude Juncker back in 2019 when he said that Europe must eventually replace the United States. He said that in a talk that was given to, I believe, some officials in Belgium. Regardless, the fact that he would say that eventually Europe has to replace the United States really indicates how the language has been increasingly intensifying as the years go by. So the article talks about the European Union charting its own path for European rearmament. And it says here, and I'm not going to read the entire article, I'm only just going to read some parts that I found to be the most relevant to our talk here. And it says here that the European Union has rolled out its first ever defense industrial strategy, aiming at boosting the competitiveness and readiness of the European defense industrial and technological base. While the strategy is the first document entirely dedicated to the defense industry, it is the latest of a series of strategies and agendas to both rationalize and incentivize European Union member states' collective efforts in defense and to raise the European Union's profile as a credible security and defense player. So in other words, America is not going to be the only military machine in the world, the only major military machine in the world. The EU needs to rise. The EU needs to project its strength onto the rest of the world. The EU needs to be capable of not only defending itself, but also capable of actually going to war, capable of even being on the offensive, capable of actually dictating foreign policy in other countries. This is really what has been lingering about in much of the political discourse within the European Union. Everyone's talking about Liverpool and West Ham United and soccer and this and that. And that's all just a big distraction. What's going on behind the curtains? If you actually take the time to read the news and search things on the news, you will see what's been talked about, what's been actually discussed on within political circles, and you will see that a big topic in Europe, as far as political discussion goes, is increasing the military capacity in Europe. And this is why, for example, you will see a story such as Germany, Poland, and the Netherlands agreeing to form a military Schengen so that Polish soldiers can move into Germany or the Netherlands, and they can transport military munitions and supplies and technology into those other two countries, and vice versa. Netherlands and Germany can move their soldiers and supplies and munitions into Poland, and the Germans can, the Dutch can do the same thing. And that's why the Germans for years have been talking about military integration. That's a big, big topic now. And they have actually taken steps to do this. This is not just something that's lying on paper, everyone. This has actually been done. Just recently, the Dutch have integrated virtually their entire military into the German armed forces. And I am shocked that this is not a big story. I'm just shocked that this is not a big story. I'm shocked. What's going on? What the hell is going on? And this is something that is to the likes of what the Germans were aspiring to. The Germans wanted the same thing. The German Nazis, I should be more specific, were working to integrate the militaries of Europe into the military force of the Reich. And that is why they had all these Waffen SS divisions. They had the Waffen SS unit called Germania, the SS Germania, into which they would put Germanic European fighters, soldiers from Denmark, from the Netherlands, people who are Germanic ethnically speaking. This is why they had an SS Charlemagne. This was a French Nazi unit. This is why they had the Scimitar Division for Albanian Muslims. This is why they had the Hanzar Division for Bosnians. This is why they incorporated the Ustasha into the SS, the Croatian fighters into the SS. This is why they had the SS Galician or the Nachtigall, these who were Ukrainian fighters, into the SS. This is why they were incorporating people from the OUN into the SS. The Germans were working on serious military integration and the reason is very simple. The Germans could not do it alone. The Germans were not able to take over massive amounts of territory alone. They were not able to maintain territory alone. They needed the help of auxiliary forces. They needed manpower. The same thing goes for today. The Germans are talking about military integration with other Europeans. Why? Because they have no choice. The Germans can't do this alone. The Germans are not going to be able to have a massive military force just by themselves. They are going to need the help of their fellow Europeans, of their neighbors. That's the bottom line. So this is why they're talking about military integration, and they're talking about creating a pan-European military force. So let's go on with this article here. So it says here, this new non-binding strategy signals a leap forward in the European Union's ambition to become ready for war in unpredictable times for the continent, with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and increasing doubts, and this is probably the most important part in this paragraph, increasing doubts about sustainability of the U.S. commitment to Europe's security. And this is why there's so much discussion on Donald Trump and what Donald Trump has been saying about NATO and what Donald Trump has been saying in regards to what he would do foreign policy-wise if he were to become if he were to be president again. And his rhetoric has been nothing but cause for consternation amongst the Europeans. The Europeans are very concerned because Donald Trump basically said, hey, if Russia invades you, you deserve it. I'm not going to care. Who cares? And you know that meme where, well, I won't say it. It's kind of a dirty joke, so I'm not going to go there. But this is one of the points of rhetoric that keeps getting referenced to justify and to motivate Europeans to accelerate their arms industry, to build up and to strengthen their arms industry. And this has been going on for a while. I mean, the same sort of thing was happening before Trump won the first time. He was talking about how he was against NATO, et cetera, and then when Trump got elected, when he got elected in 2016, he didn't really speak in a very he didn't speak in a way that is he didn't speak in a way that people are used to. He didn't speak in a way that that we're accustomed to hearing when it comes to the American empire. He wasn't talking about defending Europe. He wasn't talking about any of that stuff. He was talking about America not doing so much of the work and letting other countries handle the work of foreign policy. So that's why, for example, he said, forget Syria, who cares, let someone else take care of it. What was he talking about at that point? He was talking about Turkey running Syria, and that's why the Trump administration was talking to Turkey about a roadmap for Syria, and this is why the Americans allowed Syria to go into northern Syria. They allowed Turkey to go into northern Syria. And under the Trump administration, there was more of a focus on China when it came to foreign policy. So the Americans are more and more focusing on China as opposed to Europe. So with this in mind, the Germans have been working on building up their military and working on military integration with other Europeans. And this is why, for example, you see the Germans talking about being more independent as far as building up their own military weapons, building up their own military technology, and boosting up their military industry. And it says here, okay, nevertheless, as shown by the European Union's robust response to the war in Ukraine, there might be more than meets the eye in the new strategy, and perhaps more importantly, with heightened fears over an isolationist future administration in Washington and a dysfunctional NATO, the European Union's efforts may represent the best opportunity for Europeans to shoulder their fair share of the transatlantic security responsibilities, etc., etc. And there's a part here that I found very interesting, and it was about Europeans wanting, basically saying that the EU wants its members to start to purchase more European military technology, to the point where they are going to have to it's to the point where almost half of their purchases for military equipment is going to have to be European. So it says here, the documents set out, so this is very interesting. So it says here, the documents set out ambitious targets. So it says here, okay, the baseline of the strategy is for Europeans to spend more, better, together, and European. So basically, we got to be more focused on Europa. We have to be more focused on buying European military technology and weaponry, not American. See, and this is very significant, because one of the things that America does to keep itself in the prime position, to keep itself in the highest position, is making very, very good military technology and getting other countries to buy it. And that maintains America's empire over those countries. It maintains America's role in those countries' defense. But if those countries are buying European weapons, if they're buying German military technology, if they're buying German tanks, or if they're buying Swedish military technology, and Sweden does have a very robust military industry, then Europe is not going to be so dependent on the Americans. And what this will do is it's going to make more and more of an independent European bloc. So the EU, or much of Europe, will be its own bloc of power. And the question is, who's going to lead that bloc of power? It's going to be Germany. That's just the bottom line. Germany is the highest country when it comes to economics. It is the highest country. It's the most powerful country when it comes to industry and when it comes to finance. It's a huge export nation. It has one of the biggest economies on earth. If any country is going to lead the EU or lead Europe, it's going to be Germany. So what happens if America is not so much involved in European matters? Then Germany will take the lead. Germany will be at the helm leading Europe. And this is why, for example, a number of years ago, Olaf Scholz said that Germany needs to be the number one country when it comes to the defense of Europe. Germany needs to be the leading defender of the European continent. What does that mean? It means that, it means make Germany great again. It means make Germany's military powerful again. We're talking about the revival of German military power. This is very, very significant given the fact that we had literally 2 world wars over this problem. And here we are making the same damn mistake again. It's like, we had 2 world wars over this. Let's not make the same mistake again, but here we are making the same mistake again. Why? Because Russia bad. That's what it comes down to. So it says here, as such, EU institutions are underlining that the increase in defense spending witnessed since the start of the war in Ukraine is not sufficient if it does not address structural issues of capability gaps on critical enablers, fragmentation, and dependence on non-EU providers, which means America. 78% of purchases since February 2022, out of which 80% is from the United States. So 78% of purchases that European countries make of military technology come from countries that are not European. 80% of those purchases are from the United States. So really, this is American power maintaining itself, and this is European countries being dependent on American military technology. This is how America maintains the dependence that other countries have on America. The documents set out ambitious targets by 2030. Now, this is very significant. By 2030, member states are expected to devote half of their procurement budget to purchases from the EDTIB. And EDTIB is, if you go back up here, it is European Defense Industrial and Technological Base. So purchases from the EDTIB to procure at least 40% of their equipment in a collaborative manner. So basically they're saying, listen, 14% of your equipment needs to be European by 2030. By 2030, you're going to be having to get 40% of your military purchases from European companies. So the Europeans are seriously, really pursuing forming their own block of military power. And who's going to lead this? It's going to be Deutschland. Deutschland, über alles. Deutschland, ober der Welt. And to raise the value of intra-EU defense trade to 35% of the overall value of the EU defense market. So there you go. So they want to make it to the point where almost half of the equipment that EU countries will get will be from Europe. So today there is a phenomena of pan-Europeanism. There's a lot of talk about collectivizing Europe's defense. And of course, the Germans want to be the head of this collective defense within this pan-European defense force, military force. And my contention is that we can see parallels between what the Europeans are doing now and what the Nazis, to an extent, were doing and what they were aspiring for. The Nazis were aspiring for a pan-European force And not only that, but they were aspiring to create a pan-European bloc that would have no passports, that would have free travel from within it, no borders between European countries, and this aspired pan-European bloc would have a collective defense force led by Germany. And this is one of the things that the Nazis, some Nazi thinkers, aspired for. And this was the dream that they had for the post-war world. And it's very ironic because, interestingly enough, what they wanted sort of happened because the Germans got the EU. So in a way, the Americans were giving and taking. They were saying, "Okay, Germany, you want to lead Europe economically. We're going to help you with that. You're going to be allowed to lead Europe industrially as well. So you're going to be the financial / industrial powerhouse of Europe." So in a way, the Germans kind of got what they wanted. The only problem is that the Germans got their military oomph taken away from them. They got their military strength taken away from them, and they were forced to be dependent on the Americans. And this has been the case ever since the end of the war. But this is gradually changing, and the rhetoric has been gradually changing. And there is a very interesting quote that I want to show you guys. This is from Yanis Varoufakis. But before I state the quote, I want to present to you another observation that I have made. The fact that the Nazis wanted a pan-European bloc leads us to the question. The idea of a pan-European bloc does not prevent the revival of a Third Reich, or the revival of Nazi Germany, or the revival of something akin to Nazism. Because one of the ideas behind the European Union was so that World War II would not happen again, was so that an inter-European war, that peace could be maintained and sustained within Europe by simply uniting the Europeans under a single currency. But the fact that the Nazis wanted more or less the same thing tells us that an EU bloc actually is not a guaranteed prevention for a world war. It's not a guaranteed prevention against a revival of something akin to Nazi Germany. And I want to present to you guys a quote from Yanis Varoufakis. "A united Europe based on free trade, capital movements, common labor laws, and a single currency is unfortunately as compatible with a Nazi agenda as it is with a progressive, humanist, internationalist one." So even if you have a united European bloc, it does not prevent the revival of a Reich or a German despotism. And I want to show you guys two quotes. The first quote is from Arthur Seyss-Inquart, and he was an Austrian Nazi who signed the Anschluss, basically agreeing for Austria to become one with Germany and thereby reviving the Reich. And this was the quote from Arthur Seyss-Inquart. He says, "Above and beyond the concept of the nation-state, the idea of a new community will transform the living space, Lebensraum, given us all by history into a new spiritual realm. The new Europe of solidarity and cooperation among all its peoples, a Europe without unemployment, without monetary crisis, will find an assured foundation and rapidly increasing prosperity once national economic barriers are removed." In other words, a Europe under a single currency. So the Nazis were already thinking of this idea of pan-Europa. They were thinking of this idea of a pan-European bloc that would be united by one currency, united economically. The second quote is from Joseph Goebbels. Everyone has heard of Joseph Goebbels, and he said this back in 1940. He said, "The people of Europe understand increasingly that the great issues dividing us, when compared with those which will emerge and will be resolved between continents, are nothing but trivial family feuds. I am convinced that in 50 years, Europeans will not be thinking in terms of separate countries." So Goebbels was talking about unifying all the Europeans. Now, I have heard the argument, and this argument I heard from the historian Michael Burleigh, that yes, while the Nazis did speak of a pan-Europa or a pan-European bloc, they didn't really speak in such a way in the sense that they really loved the idea of European unity. They only spoke in such a way because they had the idea of a European Reich that would be led by Germany. In other words, the Germans were only focusing on their own power, and they only spoke of pan-Europeanism to their advantage. It was, in other words, to unite all Europeans under Germany, and this rhetoric was spoken only with the intention of German power. And so therefore, Berle makes the argument that we should not make any sort of parallels between what the Nazi Germans were aspiring to and the European Union today. Now, this is my response to such an argument. I would concede, and I would say that I agree with Mr. Berle that the EU today and the Third Reich they're worlds apart from each other, obviously. I mean, there's no concentration camps in Europe, at least not yet. And I would also say that, yes, it is true that when the German Nazis were speaking of pan-Europeanism, they were only speaking in such a way with the intention of German power. But who is to say that the Germans do not have the same mindset today? Who is to say that the Germans today want to maintain pan-Europa for their own industrial or economic power? I believe that the Germans want to maintain pan-Europeanism for the sake of being number one in Europe, because it helps Germany. What I will also say is that while the EU is a world apart from the Third Reich right now, who is to say that the EU cannot transform into something akin to the Third Reich? And this is why it's very dangerous to think that just because we have the EU, that it cannot metamorphose into something that is diabolical and sinister. It can definitely do that. And this is what Yanis Varoufakis is trying to warn about, that do not think that just because you have the EU that the Third Reich cannot be revived. Now, I want to show you guys some more quotes from Nazi and fascist thinkers. This one is from Hans Frohwein. Hans Frohwein made this statement in June of 1943 to the Foreign Ministry's Europe Committee, entitled Basic Elements of a Plan for a New Europe. So the Germans were talking about a new European order. The Nazis were. They spoke a lot about establishing a new order, and this sort of rhetoric was quite prominent in the years 1940 and 1941. They talked a lot about establishing a new order, and the idea of a new order was basically establishing something like the EU, which would be a power block of European countries led by Germany and united economically. And it was fairly simple, the idea, nothing really complicated. The parallel between that idea and what we see now is not too far apart. So Hans Frohwein said this: the solution to economic problems with the eventual object of a European customs union and a free European market, a European clearing system, and a stable exchange rates in Europe, looking towards a European currency union. So Hans Frohwein was talking about establishing something like the European Union, and this was back in 1943. The next quote comes from Alberto De Stefani. Alberto De Stefani was Mussolini's first finance minister, and this statement comes from 1941. And he said, quote, "The results of excessive nationalism and territorial dismemberment are within the experience of all. There is only hope for peace by means of a process which, on the one hand, respects the inalienable fundamental patrimony of every nation, but on the other, moderates these and subordinates them to a continental policy. A European Union," this is from Alberto De Stefani, Italian fascist, "a European Union could not be subject to the variations of internal policy that are characteristic of liberal regimes." So already they were talking about a European Union, and this was back in 1941. The next quote comes from Camillo Pelisi. Camillo Pelisi was the editor of Civiltà Fascista, and he wrote an article entitled "The Idea of Europe." And he wrote this in September of 1943, and he said, quote, "A new Europe, that is the point. And that is the task before us. It does not mean that Italians and Germans and all the other nations of the European family are to change their spots and become unrecognizable to themselves or to one another. From one day or 1 year to the next, it will be a new Europe because of the new inspiration and determining principle that will spring up among all these peoples. The problem of the hierarchy of states will no longer arise, at least in its usual form. Once we have cut off the dragon's head, that is the notion of state sovereignty. Moreover, this does not have to be done outright, but can be achieved indirectly, e.g. by creating interstate European bodies to look after certain common interests, exchange rates, communications, foreign trade. So you can see here this quote from this Italian fascist scholar, Camillo Pellisi. He is saying that we need to have a European Union. And he goes so far as to say that the idea of sovereignty should be dissipated. Now, that's never going to happen, and the idea of sovereignty is always going to be there. It's there right now. I mean, this is the reason why there are tensions between Germany and Poland, because the Polish people and the Polish government are trying to maintain their own sovereignty and observe and follow their own interests. And this is why Poland has not really fallen for the idea of absorbing excessive or an influx of migrants. This is the reason why Poland has been spending more than any other European country on its military defense and on its military apparatus. This is the reason why there is a struggle between the European Union and really between the Germans and the Poles over morals, over morality. The Poles say we don't want abortion. The Poles say we don't want homosexuality in our country. And the EU says, well, you can't do that. You are discriminating against women, and you're discriminating against sexual minorities and all this talk. So the pursuit of sovereignty is still there. Next quote is from Cecile von Renthe-Fink. Cecile von Renthe-Fink was a Nazi diplomat holding the rank of Minister of State, and he made this statement in, I believe, 1943. There was a document written by Fink in which he recommended the need to, quote, put forward a European confederal solution based on free cooperation among independent nations, culminating into uniting Europe on a federal basis. To see this federation process through, all that is required of European states is that they be loyal, pro-European members of the community and cooperate willingly in its task. The object of European cooperation being to promote peace, security, and welfare for all of its peoples. It sounds like rhetoric that you hear coming out of the EU today. It really goes to show that just because you have an EU does not mean that a Third Reich cannot be revived. The next quote is from a figure that everyone has heard of to some extent, Vidkun Quisling. I mean, we've all heard the term Quisling, right? The word Quisling means traitor. But where does that word come from? It comes from Vidkun Quisling. He was a devout Nazi, and Quisling betrayed his country of Norway. He gave information on I believe, the air bases to the Nazis, and that helped the Nazis, logistically speaking, when they invaded Norway. And then Quisling was given a prominent position of power by the Nazis, although he didn't last too long. He was eventually replaced. And Quisling, the name Quisling became synonymous with being a traitor. So that Quisling, that traitor. And that's why, because he betrayed his nation of Norway. So Quisling said, we must create a Europe that does not squander its blood and strength on internecine conflict, but forms a compact unity. In this way, it will become richer, stronger, and more civilized, and will recover its old place in the world. National tensions and petty jealousies will lose their meaning in a Europe freely organized on a federal basis. World political development consists inevitably in the formation of larger political and economic spheres. Here's a quote from someone that we have all heard of. Here's a quote from Adolf Hitler. This is what Hitler had to say. He said, "It is not very intelligent to imagine that in such a crowded house like that of Europe, a community of peoples can maintain different legal systems and different concepts of law for long." In other words, a European Union. And then Joseph Goebbels said, "In my view, a nation's conception of its own freedom must be harmonized with present-day facts and simple questions of efficiency and purpose. Our only requirement of European states is that they be sincere and enthusiastic members of Europe." So there you go. Major Nazi figures, including Hitler, were already talking about a united Europe under Germany. And what do we have today? We have a united Europe that is dominated by Germany. Not much. I mean, a lot has changed, don't get me wrong. But as far as the idea of a structure of a united Europe, what the Nazis wanted is to a certain extent here. All that is required is for the EU to turn fascist or to turn extremely despotic. And I'm not talking about, oh, well, they're arresting protesters. I mean despotic to the point where they're making death camps and they're forming a serious military power, which is what the EU wants to do. Really, ultimately, this is what Germany wants, and the French also want it as well. But then the question comes, how long are the French going to maintain a serious friendship or a serious alliance with the Germans? Are the French always going to be on the good side of Germany? Let's not forget, half of France was a pro-Nazi state at one point in time. All of, I believe, southern France was controlled by the Vichy regime, which was a pro-Nazi, far-right regime. And it was very racist. It was very anti-Semitic. And there are some aspects of Vichy France that I find to be quite reminiscent to some of the things that we see today in France. So, for example, Vichy France was far-right. It was racist, but was it exactly like the Nazis? Was the ideology of the Vichy exactly like the Nazis? No, it wasn't. It wasn't entirely the same. Vichy fascist, Vichy far-rightist were more like some of the far-right trads that you see in France today. They weren't Nazis. A lot of them were not Nazis to the point where they wanted to do experiments on people. That was more of a German thing, because the German Nazis, they were more into scientism. They were more into Darwinism. Whereas the French fascists, not all of them, but a lot of them were into Catholic traditionalism, and they had this aspiration of reviving the Middle Ages, they had more of a medievalist point of view, and they had this idea that they were going to go back in time to some sort of golden era that they had idealized. And this is the reason why you had something called the SS Charlemagne, which was a big division of French Nazis. Thousands of Frenchmen joined the SS Charlemagne, and even at the end of the war, even not at the end of the war, but even right before the end of the war, where it became obvious to most people that Germany was going to be the loser, still thousands of Frenchmen joined the SS because they truly, truly believed in their hearts that they were fighting for a noble cause. They really believed that they were fighting in a crusade against Bolshevism. And that was the sort of propaganda that was utilized in France, that was lingering about in France. It was that they were fighting in a crusade against Bolshevism. So the rhetoric changed based on the culture. In Germany, it was more so the Jews are parasites, they're inferior, they are the Untermenschen, we are the Darwinistic victors over the world, we are the strong men of Darwinian evolution. We are the strong people within the paradigm of survival of the fittest, and we're going to destroy the inferiors. The Slavs, the Poles especially, the Russians, they are inferior Slavic people, and we have to enslave them and destroy them. Whereas with the French, it was more so, we are the successors of Joan of Arc. It was that sort of rhetoric. So they had more of a medievalist way of thinking. Whereas with the Nazis were very anti-clerical, very anti-Catholic. In a way, the legacy of Luther was still resounding within the minds of a lot of Germans, because there was a lot of anti-Catholicism in Nazism, even though you did have Catholic Germans who subscribed to Nazi ideology, albeit, to be fair, the majority of Catholics in Germany were very anti-fascist. and that is why you had a lot of persecution against Catholics under the Third Reich. But the Vichy consisted of most of southern France, and they they were an ally, a huge ally to the Nazis. I talked about this in my video that I uploaded today. Why were the Nazis so much more barbaric in Eastern Europe than they were in France? And the reason was because they saw the French as being more of a cultured people. Even though they didn't really admire the French too much, they still believed that the French were a cultured people, and that the French were more reliable and more efficient. Whereas when they looked at the Slavs, they saw people who were not reliable, who were incompetent, and they saw people who really couldn't build serious infrastructure. They looked down on the Slavs. They said, oh, these Slavic people, they can't really build a society. They can't really build a sufficient industrial country. They're backwards. They are just inferior to us. And because they had this social Darwinian perspective on the Slavic people, and on themselves, because they saw themselves as superior genetically, when they were in Eastern Europe, they were given the freedom to unleash all of their cruelties, all of their brutalities, all of their sadism on the civilian population in Eastern Europe, be it in Russia, be it in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, a lot of the killing was done by Ukrainian collaborators, and this is why they slaughtered this is why the Ukrainians slaughtered ethnic Poles, and the Germans didn't stop it. This is why the Ukrainians butchered so many Jews. There is the biggest massacre of Jews in the Holocaust, the massacre of I think it's called Baba Yar. This is how evil the Nazis were. I mean, they were just absolute monsters, these people. I don't give a damn what conservative views they may have claimed to believe in. They were truly a part of the Antichrist system. And yes, the Nazis did say that they believed in certain principles that conservatives today would agree with, but so did the Pharisees who crucified Christ. The Pharisees had conservative views as well, but we would still consider the Pharisees to be diabolical. Babi Yar, everybody. Babi Yar is a ravine in the Ukrainian capital Kiev and a site of massacres carried out by Nazi Germany's forces during its campaign against the Soviet Union in World War II. The first and best documented of the massacres took place on 29 to 30 September 1941, killing some 33,771 Jews. Other victims of massacres at the site included Soviet prisoners of war, communist, and Romani people. It is estimated that a total of between 100,000 and 150,000 people were murdered at Babi Yar during the German occupation. So, when we talk about the German occupation of, let's say, France, or let's say Denmark, or the Netherlands, or Norway, these occupations, while bad things were done, these occupations were nowhere near as horrific as what the Germans were doing and what the Germans and their auxiliaries were doing in Eastern Europe, and they butchered millions of people. And it was because they were given free reign in those countries. When they were in Northern Europe or Western Europe, when they were in Denmark or the Netherlands or Norway, the Nazis were told that the native populations in these countries are fellow Germans. Norwegians are Germanic, Danish people are Germanic, Dutch people are Germanic, so we can't be barbarians here. These are our fellow Germans. That's how they saw it. So in the law of social Darwinism, these are not our inferiors. But when they went to Poland, well, now they were occupying inferiors. When they went to Ukraine, when they went to Yugoslavia, the Balkans, then they said that these native populations are inferior to us and they deserve nothing but enslavement and destruction. And this is what happened. And that was the horrors of the Third Reich. And this is why we have to be so vigilant against Nazism. This is why we have to be so vigilant against this evil, because if we're not vigilant, and if we become indifferent, or if we become agitated anytime someone brings up the Holocaust because we're tired of hearing about it, then, well, once we ignore the evils that were inspired by demons, then the demons who inspired those evils will just come back and resume from where they left off. Simple as that. The Nazis, they had a concept of European civilization, and they believed that they were upholding true European civilization. Not only that, they believed that they were reviving. European civilization. And I just want to give you guys an example of what I mean here. The man who was appointed to be the head of the general government in Nazi-occupied Poland, Hans Frank, stated in an interview, and I'm going to read to you guys what he said. My one ambition is to elevate the Polish people to the honor of European civilization. So these people are inferior. We are bringing them true civilization. And I don't understand how the Germans were bringing the Polish people's civilization by exterminating them. I mean, the Spanish brought civilization to the native population in Mexico. They didn't exterminate the native population. They Christianized the native population. And they brought those people Christian European civility. The Nazis did not bring civilization. They brought social Darwinism, which is just genocide. So today there is a very strong will for Europe to become independent. And there is talk about Europe, grabbing the reins of its own destiny and pursuing independence from American power. And this was reflected in the words of several big EU players. I've talked about this many times. Angela Merkel, I believe in 2017 or 18, saying that Europe must lead its own destiny and that we can no longer trust the Americans or the British. And the reason why they said the British was because of Brexit. The reason why they said the Americans was because of Donald Trump, basically saying to hell with NATO and let's focus more on America. But you also have Macron. Macron said, I remember a number of years ago, that NATO is brain dead. This is what Macron said. NATO is a brain dead institution. And Macron also stated in April of 2023 that Europe can shape its own destiny. And this type of rhetoric really bespeaks a desire to be independent of American power. And I want to give you guys an example as to how this parallels with the past. So in March of 1943, there were foreign policy experts for the German foreign minister Ribbentrop. And they got together in March of 1943 and they wrote a draft foundation document for a European confederation. And this is what the draft stated, quote, in order to give tangible expression to the common destiny of European peoples and to ensure that wars never break out again among them, the states here represented have for all time established a European Union. And this was written by the foreign policy experts for the German foreign minister Ribbentrop. So they were talking already about a European Union. And they were talking about a common destiny for Europe. So the Nazis had this idea of a common destiny for Europe. And you see this sort of rhetoric happening today. It's almost as if the EU is saying, well, we have our union. We have this union that we want. All that we need to do at this point is just form a Reich with a military force and have Germany as its leader. And so this is why you see the Germans talking about military integration, integrating the European militaries into one. And we've seen this already. I mean, I am shocked that this did not become major news when the Dutch military integrated virtually all of itself into the German armed forces. The Nazis had this idea of military integration. This is why you see all of the Waffen-SS divisions from various countries: Hungary, Romania, Bosnia, Albania, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Ukraine, etc. So part of this pursuit for being more independent of American power, this was something that existed in the Third Reich. After World War I, America solidified its position as the dominating power. And the Americans were resented by the Germans and by the other Europeans as well. The Americans were resented. And so when the Third Reich formed, they had this idea of toppling American power. They had this idea of being above American power. And the idea was to overthrow the American empire. And this came out of the mouth of the Rexist Wallonian Nazi Leon Degrelle. A Rexist, by the way, there was not a big move, but there was a movement in Belgium at this time called the Rexist movement. This was basically just a monarchist movement. They wanted to bring back the king. They were Nazi. Not all Rexists became Nazis, but the Rexists were monarchist. But there was one Rexist who did become a famous SS Nazi. His name was Leon Degrelle. He was a Wallonian Nazi. And he stressed that Belgium was a jetty to North American markets. So what do you see today? I mean, for years we've been seeing this struggle between the EU and America. This idea that America should not dictate everything for Europe has been in Germany for decades now. You can go all the way back to the Clinton administration and see the Americans angry at the Germans for having any sort of ties with the Iranians. And when Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, the Americans were pushing the Europeans to no longer have any sort of financial ties with the Iranians. And what happened? I remember seeing the Germans talking about establishing independent financial channels in Belgium by which to maintain commerce with the Iranians. What was that about? That was the Germans giving the middle finger to the Americans. And that initiative, by the way, was done by Heiko Maas. Heiko Maas, who was a major German politician. I'm not sure where he is right now, but I remember when Trump was president, he was an official in the German government. He was the foreign minister, if I'm not mistaken. And Heiko Maas said, well, we need to establish a independent financial channel free from American control by which we can maintain commerce with the Iranians. That was the Germans just giving the middle fingers to the Americans. So there has always been this struggle between Germany and the U.S., and the Germans have been struggling to maintain some sort of independence. And the Germans eventually, they have been talking more and more about being more focused on Europe, buying European military technology, talking about being more focused on Europe, being more European. Pretty soon they're going to just start saying Europe for the Europeans. And it's just very obvious what's happening. It's very obvious that the Germans are pursuing independence from American power. And when the Nazis were talking about their how they wanted the world to look like after the war, they were talking about creating a giant federation, a European federation led by Germany, and it would be basically above America, and that there would be no more American power, or at least it would be in a superior position to the United States. And for example, the Norwegian Nazi collaborator Vidkun Quisling, he said that he wanted a, quote, pan-Germanic federation, unquote, with a federal flag and, of course, the Führer as president. Anton Mussert, co-founder of the National Socialist Movement in the Netherlands, he dreamed of a Germanic Reich consisting of a confederation of states, of European states, with the Waffen-SS as Europe's common defense. And what did Olaf Scholz say not too long ago? He said that Germany must lead Europe in defense. The Germans want to lead Europe as a military power, but they can't do it alone. They can't be a military power alone. They have to integrate other European fighters into their collective military force. So all of the ideologues who wanted a Nazi-united Europa agreed that Germany should be the organizer of Europe's defense. And what is Olaf Scholz saying? That Germany must lead Europe in defense. So that's what's going on. That is what's going on. It is a pan-European idea. Germany wants to lead it, and eventually what's going to happen, and it's not that complicated, but eventually what's going to happen is you're going to have a European bloc of power. And it's not going to be the EU that we have become accustomed to. It's going to be a transformed EU. It's going to be a Reich. That's what it's going to be. And it's going to consist of a German military, but it's also going to consist of soldiers from other European countries. And I think this is one of the reasons why the French are talking about bringing back mandatory conscription. And there's been a lot of serious talk in Germany right now to bring back mandatory military conscription. Why? Because they're preparing for a war. Simple as that. They're preparing for a war with Russia.